Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Caroline from Earthwatch, and I'm pleased to be hosting the second Earthwatch webinar in our current series, which is focusing on the importance of forest conservation. Today, we will be speaking with Dr. Richard Bodmer, an honorary professor of conservation biology at the University of Kent, and the lead scientist on Earthwatch's Amazon riverboat exploration expedition in the Peruvian Amazon, where he has conducted research and has been at the forefront of supporting community-based conservation for over 30 years. Dr. Bodmer's commitment to working with the indigenous communities of the Amazon has been presented in many reports, compilations, and many peer-reviewed publications, culminating in his recent book, Climate Change and Wildlife in the Peruvian Amazon. His findings on the impacts of increasing droughts and floods on the wildlife and people of the Amazon were presented at the UN Conference of the Parties, or COP20, in Peru in 2014. Earthwatch is honored to have partnered with Dr. Bodmer for the past 14 years, and we're happy to be sharing his expertise with you today. So before I hand it over to Dr. Bodmer, I want to encourage all of our participants to ask questions. You may do so at any point during the presentation or afterwards. We will be waiting until the end of Dr. Bodmer's talk to answer your questions, and you can submit them at any time using the Q&A feature, which is at the center of the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So welcome, Richard. Thanks so much for joining us today. I will hand the floor over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline, for the introduction and the opportunity to give this talk today on the work that we've been doing in the Amazon. I'm now going to put up the PowerPoint, and so what I'll be talking to you today is about forest and wildlife conservation in the Peruvian Amazon. I'm going to try to get this on full screen. Doesn't seem to be loading on full screen. Oh, well. And the work in the Amazon has been going on now for over 30 years. And let me first show you where we are. Here we are. We're working in Loreto, Peru, which is in the western part of the Amazon. The Amazon includes 7 different countries. And so Peru has a major part of the Amazon, and here you can see that on the map. It's a large area, slightly smaller than California, Loreto, Peru, where we work. It's 375,000 square kilometers. And what's important here, there's 2 major landscape features. One is called the flooded forests, and these are seasonally flooded forests where for half of the year there's water on the understory of the forest, and the other half of the year it's dry. And then 2/3 of this section of the Amazon is in the upland, the terra firma forest, which are non-flooded forests, so the ground is dry all year. And what we found over the years of research and been working there is that the conservation and management strategies are very different between these 2 landscapes. And the flooded forest is caused by something called the Ucumara Basin, which is a depression that was a result of the Andes uplifting many millions of years ago. And so this kind of puts in context of where we're working here in the Peruvian Amazon. And now I'd like to take a little bit of a historical perspective of this. What happened is during the 1950s, 60s, and up until the 70s and mid-80s, the Amazon was very much in a downward spiral. There was overexploitation and unregulated extraction of timber, of fish, of other forest products, and of the wildlife. And I'd like to show you what happened here with the wildlife.
Richard, before you continue, sorry, this is Caroline speaking here. I can see that your presentation is not in presentation mode. Do you want to put it in slideshow mode?
Yeah, I've tried to do that and it's not happening for some reason.
Oh, okay, okay. If you hit slideshow up at the top, there should be slideshow mode that you can select.
Yeah, it isn't doing anything. All I can do is move from one slide to another.
Okay, that's fine. We can carry on as is. We can still see the slides.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So anyway, this is what happened to the wildlife. Between 1950 and 1974, there was unregulated hunting which was happening. And animal pelts became an important resource that was being exploited, including things such as jaguars, ocelot, the giant river otter, the southern river otter, among other species. And here I've put up some graphs that you can kind of see what happened there. For example, we had about 15,000 jaguars exported from this region, up to 20,000 ocelots, 15,000 southern river otters, and 2,000 giant river otters. And these are huge numbers for these type of animals to be hunted. What happened is these populations then just decreased. You can see that best here was a giant river otter. I think you can see my mouse there, hopefully. And you can see how the numbers just went down. And the numbers went down because there were no more to be hunted. They were just taken as many as they could. And so these species were in very much decline. Then, in 1974, Peru signed on to CITES and the first convention. And CITES was extremely important for many of these Amazonian species. The jaguars have recovered, the ocelots recovered, the otters have recovered. And here we see a graph from the Samiria River, one of our study sites, where we didn't see any giant river otter until 2008 when we first recorded them. And since then, it's been a tremendous increase of these animals. The pelt trade was prohibited in 1974, and it was very successful. And these species then recovered. And we even see this with other species. For example, the peccaries. Peccary is a South American pig-type animal. And so after CITES was implemented, instead of being prohibited, this trade was regulated and managed through the CITES agreements with Peru and other countries where the pelts were exported. And it's this management that really helped. And you can see that in the graph at the bottom here, that the peccary pelts basically reduced over half in terms of the exports. And this was due to the implementation of national legislation in Peru. What they did is they prohibited pelts such as the jaguar, the otters, and maintained pelts on some of the other more common species because of their subsistence law regulation. What Peru did after 1974 is they said people could continue hunting for subsistence. And these were the indigenous and the campesino people. They realized that this was an important resource for them for their food. And so the Peruvian government wanted to make sure that they weren't going to take food away from the rural people by prohibiting this type of hunting. This was a very proactive stance. Other countries such as Brazil took a very different stance, and they basically prohibited all hunting, including the species that people needed for food. And so in Peru, there was an opportunity, therefore, to do the wildlife management. In the 1980s, therefore, there started to be a real concern. Okay, you've allowed subsistence hunting, but how do you manage that? And this was a big question because in that time, a lot of people thought, well, you can't manage hunting. And therefore, that's why Brazil, for example, took their stance of, well, we can't manage it, we just prohibit it. So Peru got involved with other countries that also permitted subsistence hunting and started to ask the question, how do we manage that? And that's when I started my professional career in the Amazon, and with a group of people out there who are also very interested in this, such as people from the Wildlife Conservation Society and other institutions, said, okay, we need to do research on this. That's when this international conference on managing wildlife in Amazon and Latin America began. And it mainly began around that issue of how do we look at this subsistence hunting and can it be sustainable? And really that's when the research on a lot of these species began. At the same time, what happened was that the first community reserve was established in Peru. And this was established because the local communities came to the researchers, and they came to us, for example, and we were working with them on the research of the deer and the peccaries and these other animals. And they said, what's happening here is all these outsiders are coming into our traditional lands, and they're taking the timber, and they're taking the wildlife, and they're taking the fish. And when we go out to the lakes, we can't find any fish. We go out to the forest, we can't find any wildlife because these people have come and hunted it all or fished it all. And so they were interested in finding a solution to that. At the same time, Peru put on its books community reserves, because this has now become an IUCN category in the protected areas. That happened during the 1980s, but they were not established yet. And so with the local communities, the regional national government, the Tamshiyacu-Tahuayo Community Reserve was established as a regional community reserve. And so for the first time, the people had the ability to say, no, these outsiders aren't allowed in. And it was really interesting what happened there. In the local newspaper, there was a publication about how people from Tamshiyacu-Tahuayo were able to remove some timbermen who went in there. And this isn't a big thing these days. You think, oh, well, it happens all the time now. Back then, it was the first time. It was the first time that people actually were able to do that. And it was this that really showed us that the reason that people were interested in their traditional lands was because of food security. And if we think about this, I've put up a slide here, and you can see a Western-style grocery shop on one side, and then an Amazonian-style grocery shop on the other. That's because the local people in Amazonia, their grocery shop is basically the forest and the rivers. The rivers where they get the fish, the forest where they get the bushmeat, and they do their subsistence, agriculture and agroforestry there. And so their grocery shop is this natural area. And of course, like us, we don't want to go into a grocery shop and find it empty. We want to see a nice full grocery shop. That's what they wanted also. And that's where this whole community reserve thing came together. They wanted a full grocery shop. Well, the outsiders won't allow them to do that because they were taking everything away from them. Now that they had the ability to manage their own traditional lands, yes, they could start thinking about a full grocery shop. But what does that really mean in the Amazon? It means you have to have sustainability. You have to use the resources in a way that allows the people to use these resources, but maintains healthy populations of these resources, the bushmeat and the fish. And that's where research began in the 1990s. And there were really two major questions there. There was a question of, okay, can you use resources sustainably, such as bushmeat? And this linked then directly to the subsistence hunting question also. So that's where those two questions came together. Research on sustainability and managing subsistence hunting. The other question was, well, can communities actually do conservation and wildlife management? And The traditional view of conservation back in the 1960s and 70s was based on protected areas. And many of these protected areas are protected areas without people. A protectionist type of strategy. That if you have people, it just won't work. They're going to abuse the environment and you won't have conservation. And so that was another big question that we had. Can communities actually do conservation and at the same time use these resources sustainably? So this was a theory for us. It wasn't proven yet. And what became very important was a proof of that. It's like if you have a mathematical theory, okay, that's nice, it's a nice theory, but then you have to prove that theory. Well, that's a process that we went through for 2 decades then on the research in order to show these 2 major questions. I'd like to talk a little bit about that, about the results. And I'll focus here on the bushmeat species because these are very important for conservation. A lot of people understand that hunting and conservation, well, can they actually work together? And so one of the first things that we looked at was what species were they hunting and which ones could potentially be used sustainably. So we did a lot of work on a whole range of species in terms of their population, in terms of their reproduction, in terms of their habitat use and their feeding ecology. And what became clear is that these species could be divided into 2 major groups in terms of that hunting. One were the species that were more appropriate for the bushmeat hunting and could be used sustainably, and those species that were not appropriate. And that if you hunted them, their populations would decrease and become very vulnerable. And so it was a deer, the peccary, and the large rodents. And here we can see some white-lipped peccary, a red-brocked deer, and a lowland paca, is a rodent. And in these species, what we found was that these are the species that were the major prey species for things like the jaguar, the puma, the ocelots, margays. These were the species that were being eaten by these predators. And so they had a natural adaptation to this predation, technically known as density-dependent response, which means that if there's a lot of predators out there, these species would start reproducing faster, which meant that the populations didn't decline, therefore, when you had hunting happening, because hunters are just another predator. And so these species had that adaptation, and we found that in heavily hunted sites and lightly hunted sites and non-hunted sites, these species were having similar populations and didn't show that population decline. Then there were other species, such as the tapir, the primates, and the cats, where those species were very vulnerable to overhunting. What we found in heavily hunted sites is that populations were very depressed, very low. And you can only get healthy populations in maybe lightly hunted sites or non-hunted sites. What we find in these species, these are not common prey species. They're occasionally taken by predators, but they don't have that reproductive adaptation. So they don't reproduce fast enough. So the tapir, for example, and the primates will have about 1 young every 2 years, where peccaries can have up to 4 young in 1 year. And so there's a very large difference there in their biology. Humans, well, that's a new predator for them. Here you have people with shotguns who can now take primates out of the trees, tapirs at salt licks. The primates, for example, they're rarely taken because they live in the trees. And the tapirs are rarely taken because of the very large size and the very large tusks that they have, which are dangerous for the predators. But then you have this new predator come in, humans. And they have no adaptation to that. They can't reproduce faster because evolutionarily they haven't adapted to that faster reproduction. And therefore their populations get decimated under heavy hunting pressure. So one thing is that, okay, then the hunters, if we want a sustainable system here, the research was showing they should focus on these species which are more appropriate. And what was fortunate here is the species that were more appropriate were also the species that are preferred by the hunters. These peccaries or these pig-like animals, deer and these large rodents, those were their favorite bushmeat. The tapir isn't a favorite bushmeat because it has a very dark, oily meat to it. The primates because it's small-bodied, and the cats were hunted more because they were coming into the villages and eating pigs and dogs and things like that. So if the hunters would focus, therefore, on these more appropriate species, yes, they could be used sustainably, but we had to go further than that, of course. And so the research also included things such as sustainability models to actually get a much better idea of what would be the sustainable limits, because limits have to be put on any hunting system. It can't be open hunting. Everybody knows that. And so a managed system would have to have limits, and those could be determined through these sustainability models. And also the people involved with the management would take hunting registers and look at things like catch per unit effort, which is, okay, how many animals that they take in terms of how long they're hunting out there. And it's interesting, the wildlife, the white-tailed deer management in the United States, the Fish and Wildlife Service use the catch per unit effort system. What they do is they sell tags for people to go out hunting, and then they call up the hunters and ask if they've been successful or not. Well, they've been really successful. Well, that means there's more deer out there, and therefore the population's increasing. If they call up the hunters and everybody's really unsuccessful, oh, I didn't get any deer this year, that means that the population is going down and there's fewer animals out there. And so that allows them to manage how many tags they're going to sell in the coming year. And this is a similar system that the people out there have. When they go out hunting, they record how many days they were hunted and then how many animals they took. And therefore that gives them an idea. Yeah, are we getting more animals? Are we getting less animals? Which is showing that the population's increasing and decreasing. And that allows then for the local people to be directly involved with the wildlife management. What we also found in the research is that wildlife habitat management is very important. And that if you have a healthy environment with lots of fruit and trees, you're going to have more deer, peccaries, and large rodents. Because out in the Amazon, the deer, peccary, and large rodents, they're eating mainly fruits. And they depend on these fruit and trees, especially the palm trees. Well, the people also use the palm trees. In the past, what the people would do is they'd cut down a palm tree in order to collect its fruit. Because these trees are 20, 30 meters high and no branches to climb up. And it's quite easy to cut them because they have a hard outer bark, but a very spongy, weak inner bark. And it just takes about 10 minutes with a machete and axe to cut these trees down. And so in the past, people would collect these fruits, bring them back to the village. But then an industry began in the cities of Iquitos and other Amazonian cities, where these fruits were turned into products such as ice cream and drinks, and therefore people were cutting these trees more and more. Therefore taking the food away from the animals, and of course this is like cutting down your apple tree, right? These trees will produce fruits every year for about 30 years. So over this period of time, we've also been involved with different sustainable uses of these, developing with other institutions, climbing techniques that people now use to climb the trees. It's like the telephone industry has harnesses, and now people have learned how to climb the trees. They can take 2 racemes and leave the other 2 fruit racemes for the animals. We also found that in agroforestry plots close to villages, these trees don't grow so tall. The reason they grow so tall in the forest is because they're very light loving and they need that direct sunlight. So they have to grow quickly and tall in order to get that direct sunlight to be able to survive. But in an agroforestry system where the people have their gardens, if they plant these trees, they grow stunted, as you can see in the photograph. And therefore it just takes a ladder to go up and cut these palms and therefore the palm fruits. And therefore they don't need to go so much in the forest and take the fruits away from the animals. Now, the reason the local people were so interested in managing their wildlife was because of that food security. They wanted a lot of animals in the forest in order to have that full grocery shop. And they were involved, therefore, in focusing on animals that could be used sustainably and managing the habitats. Managing the habitats, well, what does that really mean? It means maintaining healthy, intact Amazonian forests in order for these animals to be able to flourish and have healthy populations, which then could be used sustainably. And the healthier the habitat, the greater the population, and therefore the more animals that were out there. If you then think about that, well, if they're conserving intact habitats, okay, they're conserving them for these species, a few of the species out there that they're really interested in, but they're also conserving these habitats for the 99% of the species that they don't use. All of the birds, insects, all of the other mammals, and amphibians, reptiles out there. So this then became a way to conserve Amazon forests through sustainable use. And so the people, by having this food security issue, really what they were doing is conserving the forests in their traditional lands. This is where this strategy becomes a much greater strategy in terms of Amazon conservation. And here, to show a few results from the Tamshiyacu-Tahuayo Community Reserve. What happened there? Well, as you can see here in the 1990s, the red is a vulnerable and not appropriate species, and the blue were the appropriate species. Well, they were hunting a lot of both of those species back before they implemented this wildlife management. After that, if you look into 2010, well, one thing you can see is that the appropriate species that they hunted, that also decreased. And we often see that. When you implement management, what often happens is that the number of animals generally goes down. And we saw that was the implementation of CITES in the previous graphs. But what's really surprising here is if we look at the red bar, those are the vulnerable species. And we can see that they basically gave up hunting the vulnerable species. And so this then became a very sustainable system. And in the meantime, what they were doing, they were conserving the forests and the habitats and the palm trees. And so the whole thing started to come together and was shown, yes, the people out here can manage their wildlife sustainably. Yes, subsistence hunting can be managed through community-based management. And yes, communities can conserve the Amazon through this type of community-based conservation. And so this was really the beginning of showing that community-based conservation is a strategy that can work in the Amazon. And we also then, many projects were looking at added value, such as a Peccary green labeled aspect of the Peccary pelts, which were sold from the peccaries that were hunted. What happens is the peccaries are hunted for the meat. That has a value for the local people of about $30 a peccary. The pelts are very much a byproduct. They get $1 or $2 from them, less than 10%. But there was a market there because they were exported to Europe for different products, especially gloves, which are used. And then if the people are managing their wildlife, conserving the habitats, then these pelts can be labeled green and certified, and therefore they can get added value. So people who are managing their forests and managing their wildlife, they can get now about $3 to $5 for a peccary pelt, which is about double what they used to get. This is an incentive for them, therefore, an extra incentive for managing their wildlife. Then, community-based wildlife management then started to be used in different types of areas. You had co-managed national reserves. You had the regional conservation areas, which are these community reserves, such as the Tamshiyacu-Tahuayo Community Reserve. And you had indigenous territories, where people were managing them very similar to the community conservation areas. So you had these three different types of land use systems that were helping to conserve the Amazon through this community-based system. And let's look at that then in 2000. If we look at 2000, we had under 8% of rural Loreto under this community-based system. We had the Pacaya Samiria National Reserve, which previously was managed very much as a strict protected area, but then that caused a lot of conflict because people were no longer allowed to go into their traditional lands, and the government then changed that and said, no, we're going to take the example of Tamshiyacu-Tahuayo and use a management system there that involves the local indigenous people, so the Kokama people. Then you had the Tamshiyacu-Tahuayo Community Reserve, which I talked about, which showed, yes, this can work. And then you had the beginning of some indigenous territories out there where people were also managing their wildlife very much similar to the community conservation areas. That was in 2000. And then what happened? Well, let's look at between 2005 and 2019. This thing just exploded. You now have over 50% of Loreto under community-based management, sustainable use, where these people are conserving their areas. You have a lot of green labeled programs, such as the green labeled wild meat, the green labeled peccary pelts that I mentioned, the green labeled arapaima fish, the river turtle head starting program, sustainable use of fisheries, sustainable use of palm fruits. You have community-based ecotourism in these areas, and you have sustainable use of handicrafts. What we've seen the people are looking for here, they're looking for a green economy. It's indigenous people of the Peruvian Amazon that are most upset from things such as oil spills and the contamination of their lakes and their rivers. They're upset about the illegal timber activities that occur in their areas. They don't want that 20th century type of economic that then results in their environmental failures and their territories and traditional lands being destroyed. What they're looking for is this community-based conservation. And if you think about it, the only way you can have over 50% of an area turned community-based conservation is if one, you have the government behind it, two, you have the NGOs behind it, and of course, most importantly, you have the local communities who want it. They're looking for a future which is very much a sustainable use future, a green economy. This is something which is a paradigm shift out there in this region, and is really the main reason behind the conservation of the Amazon in Loreto. Many of you might have heard about the Amazon burning this summer. And yes, it was burning, but it was burning in Brazil and other places where they have large industrial type agriculture. Amazon didn't burn in Loreto. Loreto has one of the lowest deforestation rates in the Amazon. The reason the Amazon didn't burn in Loreto is because the people weren't burning it. The reason that you have such low deforestation rates in Loreto is because people don't want to cut down the Amazon. They want these intact forests for their community conservation. So it was really Loreto having a community-based approach isn't showing the disasters of other places of the Amazon. And this has been very positive for us and really shows the importance of this strategy, especially for the future. However, there are threats, there are major issues. And what we found is that one of the major issues out there is climate change impacts. There's been an intensification, especially in the floods in Western Amazonia, but also in occasional droughts. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you have these two major types of landscapes, the flooded forest and the upland forests. Well, in the flooded forests, when we had these historic floods that happened between 2011 and 2015, this was higher than was ever recorded before. And the data goes back about 150 years. And what we saw is that there was a 95% decrease of these terrestrial mammals, the deer, the peccaries, and the large rodents, along others, such as the giant anteater, the armadillos, etc. They didn't have land anymore in 1/3 of this entire region, and their populations just plummeted. What this shows us is that these are the animals that are most vulnerable to climate change out there. And this is kind of interesting because it's the deer, the peccaries, and large rodents that I've already talked about. These are the ones that can be hunted more sustainably for sustainable bushmeat for the people to have. Yet these are the animals that are also most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we saw a similar thing with the fish, but this was during the droughts. We had a major drought, example in 2010, and the fish populations just plummeted. And again, the fish populations are usually used sustainably out here. You can have sustainable fisheries, and we've done similar models as bushmeat to sustainable fisheries. And yes, people can use these very much sustainably. What impacts these species the most are these droughts. So what we're seeing is that the climate change is actually impacting the food security. The indigenous and campesino people out in the Amazon are trying to conserve the Amazon through community-based conservation. Why are they doing this? They're doing this for their food and their land security. And it's working. And then what do you have? You have climate change coming on and impacting both the fish and the bushmeat, and therefore you start having again a food security problem. What's been really interesting in some of our more recent research is that the local people are actually managing these impacts in a way that is also sustainable. What happened when the bushmeat crashed because of these intensive floods? People gave up hunting. Okay, couldn't find animals, or maybe that's the best management strategy. Then what happened? As these animals started to recover between 2016, 17, 18, the people also didn't hunt these animals. Now that's a good management strategy, because if an animal is in recovery, the last thing you want to do is start using it. You want to use it when it has fully recovered. And so we're seeing that the indigenous people out here are taking the correct management action with this climate change impacts that are happening. And so they're really trying to do their best in terms of finding that green economy, finding a future, even under these very huge threats, which will unfortunately probably just get worse in the future, as we've been seeing all over the world. You have intensification of climates happening everywhere. Another thing I'd just like to point out is that this sustainable use strategy is a strategy that was produced in the Amazon by the Amazonian people through the research and collaboration with researchers, NGOs. this system of sustainable bushmeat and sustainable fisheries probably won't work everywhere, and we know that. And it's probably quite specific to this huge forest, was very low population. Loreto, for example, has 1.2 million people. Half of them live in the cities. And so you only have about 600,000 people living in an area the size of California. And yes, this makes for a sustainable, this makes for a reality when it comes to this sustainability. You can have community-based conservation, maybe not based on the resource use such in the Amazon, but on other types of products, terms of women's associations, as they have in India and many places. So community-based conservation, again, is much broader than what I've been explaining here, and I think that's important to understand. Then we have the importance of research and policy, and this has been a big lesson for us, that it's been the research which has shown that yes, things can be sustainably used and community-based conservation can work. After that proof happened, what happened? Over 50% of Loreto is now under this strategy. So it's very important to have that research behind that, showing the proof that yes, this can work. The research on climate change has brought attention to the world that these people are being impacted in terms of their food security, that everybody wants the Amazon to be conserved in terms of climate change because it's the largest terrestrial sink of carbon. And if you cut it down, as you saw this summer, and burn it, you're just releasing all that carbon back into the environment. But who's actually doing the conservation of the Amazon for the most part are the local communities, of the local people. And now their food security is being impacted by the climate change. It makes for a complex equation. And that in general feel that research has been really key for the current conservation policies in Loreto. But this type of research requires long-term data sets. Multi-decade data sets are needed to understand how these wildlife populations change under different hunting pressures, how they reproduce, what they feed on, in terms of sustainable use and how much people are hunting and what appropriate, not appropriate species, on the community conservation, and on these climate change issues. You have to go through all of the different scenarios from normal years to intensive floods to intensive droughts back to normal years again in order to really understand what's going on. The problem here is funding. Most grants are not long-term grants. They're 3 to 5 year grants, and then you have to find new funding sources that want you to change a question into something else, and therefore it's very difficult to get these long-term data sets in a place like the Amazon. What we found is that our collaboration with Earthwatch has allowed us to do this. Because it's the volunteers who come and join us on these projects, who help collect the data, who make sure that this expedition is going to go out and that we're going to be out there almost every month of the year collecting these data. And so it's the volunteer aspect of Earthwatch that then allows us to have these long-term data and therefore influence policy and therefore see the type of paradigm shift that we have seen today in the Amazon of Loreto, an area that is truly being conserved because of the community-based conservation and the help of institutions such as Earthwatch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. So we have several interesting questions from our audience. There were a few questions about wildlife, and then we had lots of questions about the community conservation strategies and the expansion of those strategies. So I'll start with the wildlife questions. So one of the questions, which came from Lishun, and I'm sorry if I am not pronouncing everyone's names correctly, I'll do my best. Were the communities interested in conserving predators that preyed on their food?
Yes, well, that's a really interesting question. And we had a workshop once with some local communities, and these jaguar experts came down, because the idea here is that the jaguar can be an umbrella species, right? It's a very important species, and the Western world, us, we understand that, you know, jaguars is one of these species that everybody's interested in. And then we asked the local people, well, what species are you most interested in? The jaguar or other things? And they went straight to the deer, peccaries, and large rodents. We're most interested in these bushmeat species. And you know, if somebody goes to the Amazon, what do they want to see? Oh, they'd love to see a jaguar. They definitely want to see macaws. They want to see pink river dolphins and maybe tapir. Okay, but what do the local people, what do they want to see? They want to see the pig-like animals, the peccaries, the deer, and these large rats, the rodents. Those are the ones most interested for them, because they provide the food. So it's a clear distinction there. The people usually hunt jaguars when they come into the villages and they eat the dogs and the pigs. We had an example of that in January. A family went out in the forest with their 2 kids and the 2 dogs. A jaguar went and killed one of the dogs and was going for the other dog close to the kids, and then the hunter, the man shot it. That's where we find people are currently hunting these large jaguars. And so for them, in the sustainable wildlife, they leave the jaguars alone unless they have a conflict with them.
Thank you, Richard. So we had several people who were really interested in how these conservation strategies can be used in other places in the world. So Andrew, Malcolm, Cito, and some of my colleagues here at Earthwatch are all wondering, you know, how can the learnings from the strategies used in Peru be brought to other places like Brazil? And then also, if they're not using these strategies, what's preventing them from doing so when we can see that the impact is so positive?
Okay, and let me first talk about the Brazil example. As I mentioned, in terms of the wildlife hunting, Brazil has taken a very strict stance on that. However, in terms of community-based conservation, Brazil is very much also one of the leaders. In terms of the indigenous territories where people are allowed to hunt, in terms of the sustainable development reserves and the extractive reserves that they have. And there's a lot of community-based things going on in Brazil, which is also helping to conserve the Brazilian Amazon, the Colombian Amazon, the Bolivian Amazon. There was a Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation project called the Amazon Landscape Project. What they did is they chose these big Amazon landscapes throughout Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, other places, and was asking the question, well, what conservation works best in those areas? And they all answered the same thing, community-based conservation. So while in Loreto, and this has been, I think, very special in terms of how much is currently under community-based conservation, we do see this in other parts of the Amazon very much, and we see it expanded in other parts of the Amazon. And so this international conference on wildlife management in Amazon and Latin America has very much spread throughout all of these countries. And I gave the example of Loreto here, which I think is a particularly good example. In terms of other places in the world, I think the example here is that people have to find what conservation works best for them, especially in rural areas where you have a lot of communities and a lot of landowners. What type of conservation works best within that reality? And you can find that in many of the poorer countries, It's community-based conservation in one form or another, not at all necessarily linked to hunting or fishing, but linked to other aspects of their livelihoods, such as handicraft production or agroforestry systems or women's groups getting together. And so that has to be developed in the region itself. And you see this quite a bit in India, for example. Good community-based conservation, but not based on hunting or not based on fishing. And so, and one other aspect of this, I'm sorry, I have to take a little drink here. Let's talk about Extinction Rebellion, right? You might have heard about the protests, which has happened throughout the world, but it's quite a bit here in England. This is people who are looking for a change. They're looking for a paradigm shift. How are we going to approach the 21st century after the 20th century disasters that have happened? And then we look at an Amazon region such as Loreto and the people there. Well, the people there have already done it. They found a green economy. They found a paradigm shift. And if you think about it, what they've actually done is gone back to their cultural roots, which are probably from pre-Columbian times, and saying, yes, we want an economy. We want to be able to sell fish. We want to be able to sell handicrafts. We want to be able to be involved in these certification programs which help our economy. But we want to do that in a way where we conserve our traditional lands, because those are so important for them, both economically, food security, culturally. And so they found that reality. Well, I think the people in Extinction Rebellion are looking for that reality, are looking for that change. I don't know if I answered that correctly, but a lot of that is going to come from finding what works best where you are. And that's what the Amazonian people have found in this community conservation.
Thank you, Richard. So we have a couple other questions that relate to that. One question is, what can individuals like ourselves do to help protect biodiversity and support local communities in the Amazon?
Good question. Well, you can join an Earthwatch project, for one. You can be involved in other ways. There's many NGOs who work out there, for example. And I think what you can also do is think in the broader sense also, being involved locally with your own communities where you live, trying to find better ways of doing things. I mean, a lot of the recycling, and you know, there's a lot of plastic, and what are you going to do about the recycling of plastic? What are you going to do about all the carbon produced and all that? And what solutions can you find just in your own lives, from little things you do to bigger things you might be involved with? And I think in helping the conserve the Amazon, it's realizing that community-based conservation does work. And that in itself means that, okay, you won't maybe support a new protected area that wants to kick people off of their traditional lands and say, no, that's probably not the right direction to go in, but looking for more solutions that involve the people.
Great, thank you, Richard. So I think we have time for probably one last question. So how optimistic are you for the future of the Amazon as a whole? And what is the best thing the average citizen of the Western world can do to help as part of their daily lives? So this is very related to what you were just talking about. But if you could speak to the first part of that question about your optimism or your vision on what the future of the Amazon holds. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question. I think I'm very optimistic in terms of the Amazon being conserved in the long term, if, and this is a big if the world can get it together and solve the climate change. If this world is continuing on a climate change disaster and the rate of carbon production, the rate is increasing, it hasn't even stabilized, this is not a good sign. What we've seen is that climate change is currently probably the most detrimental thing that's happening in the Amazon. And this is a world problem, and we all know it, and we've seen it everywhere. If we wouldn't have the climate change issue, I would be much more optimistic, because the Amazon's been conserved. But it's not going to be conserved if this climate change hits it, because the impacts, as we see, are by far the greatest. Over 2 million animals were killed by those intensive historic floods that never happened before. That's well over an order of magnitude more than even the worst hunting that occurred back in the 1950s and 60s. This was massive amount of animals being killed by drowning. And the fish populations are just decimated during these droughts that can happen now. They never happened before. I think my optimism in the Amazon itself is very high. My optimism for the world will depend on everybody.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that, Richard, and for sharing your work in depth with all of us. I wish we had time for more questions. We're receiving many, many really great and interesting and thought-provoking questions from our audience. If we were not able to get to your questions or comments today, we invite you to reach out to Earthwatch so we can do our best in answering those for you. You can email us at communications@earthwatch.org, and we'd be happy to continue to respond to your thoughts on the topic. Thank you so much for sharing all of your work with us, Richard. It's been a pleasure. It's an honor for Earthwatch to partner with you and your whole team in Peru, and we're really proud to be a partner in this important project. So thank you, everyone. This comes to the close of our webinar. The next Earthwatch webinar is with Dr. Mark Chandler, who will be discussing the importance of urban forests, and that will happen on November 21st. So you're all welcome to join us at that time if you wish. And thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.